back into the atmosphere. And CO2, as you know, greenhouse gas, you know what greenhouse gases are? There are more greenhouse gases. There's methane, nitrous oxide, water vapour, which people often overlook. But CO2 is the most long-lived in the atmosphere. And so it's the one that we need to worry about. This is a graph over the last 500 million years or so. We're here. And this is the last, sort of 100,000 years or so. And this is the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay? And during most of evolution, apart from a few things, CO2 has been high. And so plants, I'm going to talk about trees today, and obviously trees are plants, although you'd be surprised, some people don't see trees as plants, particularly in the school's curriculum, and I'm trying to change that. But the carbon dioxide levels have been high when plants evolved. And so the enzymes, the machinery that plants use to take CO2 and make it into sugars, doesn't really like it when CO2 is low. It's not very good at that. And so since humans evolved, the CO2 levels at the moment are the lowest they've ever been for humans. No human ever has seen CO2 levels as high as they've got now in the last 200 years. The whole of human evolution, CO2 levels have been below 200 parts per million. And 200 parts per million don't sound a lot, and it's not. 200 parts per million is 0.02%. So in this room, it's about 70% nitrogen, 16% oxygen, various other gases, but the amount of CO2 is titchy. But it has a massive impact on temperature because it does that greenhouse effect and it absorbs the heat, which then charges our climate systems, gives them more power and makes them more powerful, more changes and so on. So it's now going up. Of course, just near here in Telford was the first blast furnace where the Industrial Revolution started. Right? So we started burning all that coal and making the Industrial Revolution start just over at Bliss Hills. So it's probably quite good that we're trying to do something about it over in Staffordshire with the University of Birmingham. So this is the carbon cycle. You may be obviously familiar with this. So the key thing is the carbon dioxide in the air sits at the centre of this carbon cycle. And the key thing that we're going to be talking about in this experiment is leaves, photosynthesis, the way that the light energy from sunlight makes electrons inside the leaf, and that electricity helps the leaf make sugar. And that sugar then flows around, builds plants, builds our food. All the food we eat is ultimately coming from plants, from this wonderful reaction of photosynthesis. But then we also get leaf drop, we get decay, we get soil formation, and CO2 can come back out of the soil. The change, of course, is the burning of these fossil fuels, which is pumping more of this CO2 into the atmosphere. So what we need to know in the next years, now, but in the next 50 years is what our experiment is focusing on, is what happens if we put more CO2 there? Do we get more photosynthesis and do we save more carbon? Do the trees save us? Or does it stimulate different parts of this whole ecosystem and we end up in an even worse place? So these are fundamental questions that we need to answer. So one simple question you could ask is, will planting trees, because trees are made of the carbon that they've pulled out of the atmosphere, will planting trees get us to net zero? Will they help us? Will they save the planet? And the answer is maybe, but maybe not. And that's what this experiment, part of the data coming from this experiment, is about. And hopefully you'll see some of the ideas that feed into that question as I go through the talk. So basically we're talking about leaves, and if you look under leaves, at the underside of leaves, you'll see these little pores called stomata. And those are the mouths of the plant into which the CO2 gets inside the plant, and all the business goes on, and the leaf makes the sugars which power that carbon cycle. But evolution, making us, making all the life on the planet, is a wonderful thing, but it's not a perfect thing. And actually, plants have never fully solved the problem of colonizing the land. So all plant life, all life came out of the sea. And of course, the obvious thing about the sea is it's wet. All right? So you float around in the sea, you get your carbon dioxide, you get all your nutrients, you get rid of everything without having to do very much. You just float like an algae, like a seaweed. But as soon as you start going onto the land, and this is a model of one of the first plants that did colonize a land called Cooksonia, and it had a very rudimentary root system, and then some sort of spore things that you can see on the top in the fossils. But there are two things about the land that are a problem. You think, why did it bother? But they did, luckily, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Two things. Firstly, it's dry. Well, it's drier than the sea, fairly obvious. I'm a professor, I know these things, all right? And secondly, the soil, there isn't any soil. It's ground up rock, and it's often very toxic. It's not biologically active. So those are the two main problems that plants have to solve if they want to live on the land. I won't talk much about the nutrient side of things, but there is fossil evidence that very early on in the colonization of the land, early mosses had a symbiosis, a relationship with fungi, and the fungi helped them get nutrients. And you would recognize those, if you're a gardener, as mycorrhizae. If you're not a gardener, you'll recognize them as mushrooms that you have for your breakfast. Okay? But mycorrhizae bolt onto the plant root system and bring in extra nutrients. It's like a turbocharge of the root system. And in return, the plant gives the fungi sugar, because they can't photosynthesize. But that's a separate story. The main thing we're talking about here is it's dry. So if it's drier, what do you do about it? Well, if it's dry and you don't want to lose water in the sort of reverse way that if it's wet outside you put on an anorak, what you do, you get a cuticle. You get a waxy covering that stops the water coming out. And here you can see on a cabbage leaf, the hydrophobic waxes that are stopping the water going in here, but actually the main purpose is to stop the water coming out. Great, you can colonize the land and you can not dry out. Brilliant. Problem with that, you can't eat. Can't take in the carbon dioxide, that's your food. So you've immediately sewed your mouth shut. So this is where stomata come in. And this is a stomatal field on the underside of I think it's Tradescantia leaf. And if you look with a microscope, not particularly big one, you'll see these pores. So these are the epidermal cells on the surface of the leaf. And then these are two specialized cells called guard cells. And on the inside of the guard cells, they're like, if you took two long blooms, partially blew them up and put some sellotape on the inside, and then blew them up more, they bend, yeah? Because the outside can go more than the inside. Plant cells generate huge pressures. Guard cells have pressure about 6 atmospheres, or 3 times car tire pressure. And that pressure forces these cell walls, which are trying to close it, forces it open. And that's how the CO2 can get into the plant. So that's the partial solution to this idea that you're in a dry environment. Problem is, of course, photosynthesis works because of light. At night, there isn't any light. If you had your stomata open at night, you would lose water. Water would evaporate, but you wouldn't gain any carbon, and that would be a waste. So stomata shut at night, and they also shut when it's dry. And this illustrates this dynamic between the transpiration, the water loss, and the photosynthesis, the need to capture carbon. It's called the photosynthesis transpiration compromise. So what it means is simply giving a plant more carbon dioxide, simply giving a plant more food doesn't mean it's going to be able to take it all in, because something else, like water, may be limiting. And this starts to talk to the idea of, well, where should we plant these trees? There are other things that are limiting as well. So there's your stomata. Great, you can take in CO2. Not great, you're going to lose water. Okay? And the plant lives on a knife edge all the time, day to day, minute to minute, year to year, making decisions about whether to take in the carbon and lose water, or whether to save water and not take any carbon in. So straight away, you can see, if we think trees are going to save us from climate change, there's other things that are going to play into this. But CO2, carbon dioxide, it is the food for plants. We go to the garden centre and we buy baby bio, and we say, it says on it plant food. That's not true. That's like you going to get a bottle of vitamins and saying that's food. It's not food, it's vitamins, right? Your food is the carbohydrate. For the plant, the food is the CO2. The things, the nutrients, the minerals that are in baby bio are an additional thing. The main food, the main body of plants, the main food of plants is carbon dioxide. And this chap, he's grown this conifer under different levels of CO2 with the different additional levels, and quite clearly you can see that the tree grows bigger if you give it more food. Don't need a rocket scientist, right? No, you need a plant scientist. But anyway, if you think about it, if you've had a tomato sandwich today, almost certainly that tomato was grown in a greenhouse. And that tomato will have been grown under elevated CO2, because people who grow commercial tomatoes know that CO2 is plant food. So they buy cylinders of carbon dioxide and they pump it into the greenhouse. Okay? Great, but they don't have to worry about the photosynthesis transpiration compromise or any other issues, because you've got lights, so they're giving it the right light. They're controlling the temperature. They're giving the plant enough water. They're giving them the right nutrients, and they're controlling the pests and diseases. So the limiting factor, the thing that's holding back this plant growth, is the carbon dioxide. So the tomatoes grow bigger. Okay? That's a controlled situation. That's an artificial situation, good if you like tomatoes, but it's not what's going to happen in the real world. And that's why, so there we are in Birmingham, and you're here, but this is on Google Earth. But if you flew over just to west of Stafford to a place called Norbury Junction, you can do this on Google Earth, and if you zoom in, you'll see this. And for scale, these are cars, and these are the CO2 tanks, okay? And if you look in the woods, you might just, I'm going to shift onto another slide in a minute, but I just want you to get a sense. In this woodland, it's about 7 or 8 hectares, there are 6 enormous 25 metre wide, 25 metre high rings. This is where the CO2 comes from, because we're elevating the CO2 in those woods. We're giving some of those trees more carbon dioxide to see, and I'll explain a little bit more about it in a second. There's a static picture, same picture, but here's the rings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, okay? You see that? Huge experiment. It costs 20 million to set it up, and it costs huge amounts of money to keep it running. But if we zoom in a bit, there's another shot of the 6 rings. 3 of them get elevated CO2, and it's elevated to an extra 150 parts per million. If you go back, that is 0.015% extra tritium out, but has a big effect. Okay, why 150 parts per million, you ask? Because the models that we have at the moment tell us that in 2050, that will be the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So these trees in the 3 rings that are getting extra are acting as if it's 2050. And they're telling us from the future what the world will be like in these oak forests. They're time-travelling trees, okay, really are time-travelling trees. There's another shot, and excuse me, you get a sense here of the size of these things, but also the organisation. So there's a central pylon, and then there are these pylons around the side, and you might, I'll show you some more pictures in a minute, but if you look here, either side of each of the pylons is a black pipe, and it's exactly the sort of drain pipe you could buy from Wickes, okay, with holes drilled in it. And this is where the CO2 comes out. The way it works, unlike the greenhouse, which is unnatural, if we want to understand how the natural world works, we have to work in the natural world, the ecosystem, as much as we can. So all the infrastructure that's in the way is just the pylons. They were dropped in by helicopter, so there was minimum damage. And I'll show you some of the control systems and so on, but basically, if you imagine the wind was blowing into the picture, the detectors at all levels inside the ring would feed back to the computer, and the computer would open the valves on this side and close the valves on that side. And it operates to maintain the CO2 levels within the 3 rings that have elevated really tight levels. It works really well when it's not windy, and it works really well unless it's not windy or if it's very windy. If it's not windy, the CO2 just sinks down, and if it's too windy, the CO2 just blows away. On average, a CO2 molecule spends 3 seconds in each ring, the extra CO2. Right? And you think CO2 is a waste product, you're all breathing it out. I've already said greenhouse people buy it, so do abattoirs, so does the drinks industry, and there was a shortage a few years back, and we nearly had to switch off for a bit. The CO2, a couple of years ago, it's a bit cheaper now, £3 million a year for this CO2. We use 120 tonnes a week more if it's windy. So this is not a trivial experiment. Here's the bottom of the pylons, and there's SU for scale. And this is the pipe that carries the air, or the elevated CO2 around. You can see in the background it goes around there, comes back around here like that. And then these big little blue things, these are the last line of control. Those are where the valves are that the computer opens or closes to these black pipes. Okay? So, amazing thing. And looking up, there it is looking up, again, black pipes, pylons. The difficult thing though, is it's nice to walk in the woods, but when you like the shade and you see the dappled things, you see the plants growing at the bottom, it's all happening in the canopy. It's all happening in the canopy because that's where the light is, okay? So that's where you have to go to do the measurements. So here's some more pictures of the infrastructure. We have walkways, so we don't compress the soil. Soil is a living thing, so you can't be tramping around. This is coming from there's the tanks, this is coming from the tanks, and this is the control room. This pipe comes from the tanks into the control room, that picks up the detection inside the ring, and then that decides whether to open the valves or not, and regulate the CO2 inside. And it just blows into the ring. There's another view of it. There's the 6 rings, the 3 CO2 ones, and the 3 ambient. And what this shows is that it really works. So the blue dots are the CO2 levels, which are just natural carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. This is from March 2017. And the orange dots are the 3 treatment rings. And the point to make is, well, there's a number of points, it's a feat of engineering, right? This is a multidisciplinary project. It involves computer science, engineering, atmospheric chemistry, a whole thing before the biologists get to play with it. But you can see it's holding at the control levels, a few little technical sticky valves and so on. But excuse me. The other thing to note is this is the winter where it's dropped down. We switch on at bud burst and we switch off at leaf fall. And you could argue, quite rightly, we should leave it on all the time. But it's £3 million a year, right? So, and there isn't any light, so we don't, right? And you have to make that argument because of the cost of these things. There have to be compromises. And we switch off it, it's below 4 degrees, because at below 4 degrees you don't get any photosynthesis, so the CO2 is not going to go in anyway. So it's an amazing amazing experiment, amazing system. And basically, in there, we're tooled up to measure absolutely everything we can. From the way the trees grow, the leaf fall, the animals, the photosynthesis, the fungi, the insects, rainfall, soil nitrogen, soil respiration, absolutely everything. If you're interested in what Anna looks like, and she would be much easier on the eye than me, that's Anna. And she did the first measurements here. She did the first measurements of photosynthesis. Because if you're going to put extra CO2 in to any sort of plant system, you want to know if they're taking it in. If they're not, there's no point in carrying on any further. So, oh yeah, that's me. That's more important. So this is, I'll tell you a story about Anna in a minute, but this is me at the top of the canopy, right? So it's absolutely fantastic. Oh, I haven't got any sound. Or maybe there isn't any sound, don't know. It's only me going on about how great it is. Right, there we go. Probably just come out of my computer, I don't know. So, fantastic to be up here. This is a unique experience to be right at the top of the canopy. Hardly ever visited. Hardly ever researched, but this is where the action is. This is where the impact of climate change will really happen for these trees. I love going up there. So there's Anna at the top of the tree. Why I put that on is I went up once. They couldn't get me down. It was fantastic. But you can see I'm holding on for dear life. But Anna, for 2 years, would go round each ring all day over the whole summer, whole photosynthesis period. The way we access the canopy, there's various ways you can access canopies. Some people have cranes, like there's one being built in the Amazon now where they're going to use cranes. Some people have like go-away walkways, these type of things. We climb, right? So the central pillar has 4 crosses on it, and there is a trained climber there who winches you up on a little breeches buoy. You sit on it, and you go up with your equipment, and you do your measurements. And that's what Anna did every morning from sunrise to sunset. So she had to be there at 6 in the morning to get up the tree. Did that for 2 years. I was a supervisor, so I didn't have to do anything. I just go up and say how great it is. But this is some of the key data which came out a couple of years after we'd started. And this sets everything else off rolling, right? So there is basically the punchline is there's more photosynthesis if you give them more carbon dioxide for these trees under these conditions. And you can see that because these are the main summer months. This refers to the higher that number is, the more photosynthesis there is. This is 7 in the morning, you see, so she's starting at 6:30 on some days, right through to 7 in the evening. And the key point is, if you look at July, for example, when the sun comes up, you get more photosynthesis. When the sun goes down, you get less photosynthesis. It's not, no shit, sort of thing. The blue line is the ambient, and the red line is the elevated. And you can see she got this data over 2 years in the 6 rings. And what you can see is that invariably, for the key months, the red line is above the blue line. And approximately that translates to about 30% more carbon dioxide, 30% more sugar being made by the trees that get in the elevated CO2. So we all go, oh, happy, we're saved. The trees are going to pull all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and we can live happily ever after in 2050. Unfortunately, that's not as simple as that, is it? So the CO2 comes in, and the questions we're asking now are about, well, what does he do with that? Okay? I've already talked about stomata and water, and indeed, there were a couple of dry years, and in the dry years, the tree went, I'm not bothered about the extra CO2, I'm going to save water for a couple of years, and they didn't capture the extra carbon. So interpreting this data requires thinking about what the weather conditions are like. So if it remains wet over the summer, then yeah, if all things being equal, yeah, we will take in more carbon dioxide. But if we're going to get hotter, drier summers, then they're not going to do it. Okay? So you've got to start balancing these things up. if you're any sort of organism, in evolutionary terms, the thing that you want to do most is reproduce. Okay, you improve your reproductive fitness. So maybe they'll spend more on food, on reproducing, get more of their offspring into the next generation, maybe. And that, of course, would have impact on the animals and other things that ate the seeds they produced. If you've got more resources, you might defend yourself against pests and diseases more. And there might be a big effect on the local ecology because of that. You might grow more. Or, and this is the undiscovered country, you might put it into the soil. And that's really what the developing story is at the moment. The trees do spend some of that carbon on growing bigger, okay? This is an older slide, but the data is unequivocal. That the tree trunks grow about 9% bigger. So the trees are about 9% bigger. And so some of that carbon has been stored in the tree, which is a good thing, because oak trees, you know, be 400 years old, and that's carbon that's been locked out of the atmosphere and will remain that until somebody burns it. So that's good. And in a sustainable system, you protect your trees, you bring on the young ones, and when they got big enough, they would be sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. Incidentally, that's how you generate tree rings. The bigger your tree ring, the bigger the area of the ring, the more biomass that tree has collected. We use dendrometers, which just means tree measurer, to measure the diameter of the trees and the changes. We use electronic ones, but we have an education program where we give schools what we call BiFOR in a box, and they can install these on their own trees and measure the growth of their trees and load the data up to a website where they can look at carbon capture of trees all around the country. There's about 120 of those out at the moment, got another 70 going out for the new season. So that's where we're getting citizen science, we're trying to engage pupils in the curriculum with aspects of this experiment. So, looks like these trees are taking in less carbon dioxide, are taking in more carbon dioxide and getting more growth. Okay? Photosynthesis boost more biomass, with the caveat of there's got to be enough water. I said Anna was in Australia. This experiment of ours is built on a copy of the U-face, the eucalyptus face experiment just outside Sydney. And they don't see a big effect of carbon dioxide on these eucalyptus trees, because these eucalyptus trees are short of phosphorus. Okay? So that's their limiting factor, because the soil is short of phosphorus. So they're not bothered about CO2, they can't afford to take any more in because they haven't got enough phosphorus to drive that growth. Whereas we have higher nutrients at the moment, and we're keeping an eye on that, and we're seeing the trees showing this carbon capture. So that's quite an interesting observation. And again, as you see, caveats the excitement that these trees are actually taking in more carbon dioxide. Incidentally, it reminds me, the trees we're looking at are 180-year-old trees, oak trees, and we genetically profiled them, and they're all extremely closely related. So why do you think somebody planted oak trees 180 years ago? Ships, exactly. They're planted for Royal Navy, and then somebody invented iron ships and they forgot about them, and it's been there ever since. So I went to Notre Dame at the weekend, just like you do, and it burnt down. They found a wood that had been planted to provide the spare parts for Notre Dame that was 350 years old, that had been planted just in case it burnt down. I mean, how cool is that? But we don't use, if we used oak and other things more in construction, we'd use less concrete, and concrete at the moment is a big producer of CO2. So not only would you use the carbon captured in the wood, you wouldn't have to use concrete. So there's other changes, not just growing the tree and the tree taking the carbon out of the atmosphere. So, your Australian trees, low nutrients, no extra photosynthesis, no extra biomass. But if you have more carbon, how can you get more nutrients? How could you overcome that blockage? Well, there's lots of different ways you can do it. You could fix your own nitrogen. You know, legumes have an association with bacteria, rhizobium, that fixes atmospheric nitrogen. You could grow could send your roots out to find more nutrients. You could stimulate the soil ecosystem. You could feed the soil ecosystem, a bit like your own microbiome, that we know more and more how valuable our own microbiome is to our own health and keeping that healthy. Trees have known that for millions of years, and they feed the soil to stimulate the rhizosphere, the area around the root, in order to make it fit them and make them healthy and provide nutrients. And I've already mentioned the mycorrhizae. If you've got more sugar, you give more to the mycorrhizae. So you start to get this feedback loop. I've got more carbon. I'm going to spend it on things that might get me more nutrients, so I can then use the carbon to grow bigger. So you're getting these more complicated loops going on. So we do get more growth of roots under elevated CO2. So the roots grow, they live, they die. It's an input of carbon into the soil. So this is the depth down to 1 metre. Blue is elevated, and orange is ambient. And you can see you've got higher levels of roots in the soil. How do we know? We effectively use an endoscope. Okay, so this is a pipe that goes into the soil, Perspex pipe, and every week Gail, not him, he's left, Gail goes along, one of the technicians puts the camera down, and it takes pictures like this, and then you put it through image analysis, and it works out how much the roots have grown over the previous period. And you can also see mycorrhizae as well. So you can see the fungal growth, you can see the root growth. That's how we know the roots are growing more. So more of that carbon is going into the soil. And this is where it becomes, if you want the trees to keep the carbon, this is where it's getting a little more complicated. Obviously, oaks are deciduous, got more carbon, the leaves are a bit bigger, and we get more leaf litter. We get more leaf fall under elevated CO2. So that's a carbon rain falling on the soil. Okay, so that's one way. It's another way, second way that you get more carbon into soil. Root growth, leaf fall. So I haven't got too much time on my hands with PowerPoint. And also, so the extra carbon into the soil actually, I'll go back a second. So the extra carbon going into the soil is stimulating the bacteria, the fungi and so on in the soil. And because they live and die and respire and produce CO2, they're producing more CO2. And these are the little robots that measure the respiration of the soil. So they sit in the rings, and every so often one of them will feel he hasn't done enough work today, and it'll go down over the soil, and it will measure the rate of CO2 production. That then gets fed back to the computers and so on. And so we can measure the soil respiration, the consequence of that extra carbon. And what we see, that the stimulation of the soil bacteria does actually start to generate more CO2 coming out. So you see, remember the carbon cycle at the beginning. We put more in, the trees are taking in more, they're growing more, but they're also pumping more through the soil. And we're starting to see this come off in respiration. Now we don't know at the moment where that balance will end. Will it be net positive? Will it be net negative? And also, of course, in a way, it's never going to be a steady state because of the water situation. You know, because they're not going to capture as much if it's dry, they're going to capture more if it's wet. So what level is that going to sit at? And the other problem, some of these bacteria, if you're a gardener, are really irritating because they're denitrifying bacteria. You put all this beautiful nitrogen on the soil, and the bacteria metabolize it and blow it back off as a gas. Okay, which is why you shouldn't put your fertilizer out too early. So not only are you potentially losing carbon from the soil back into the atmosphere, you're actually losing nitrogen, which the tree wants to balance up with the carbon that it's taking in. How am I doing for time, by the way?
You're doing all right, actually, Jerry. You can do another 10-15 minutes.
Yeah, cool. Well, I just want to push away there. Anyone else wants to? But I've got a mic, so
Just keep going.
I've got a conch. Are you watching Lord of the Rings? Yeah.
Yeah.
Bit slow. Yeah. So, will planting trees help us to get to net zero? Well, in a good situation, the right tree planted at the right time, in the right nutrients, with the right amount of water, yes. Okay? But poor soil nutrients, poor water, no, it won't. Okay? So the strategy of planting trees, where you get all these grants to plant trees, maybe it's getting a bit better as people get more informed about the complexity of the situation, but originally just planting trees was seen as a panacea, but it's clearly not, unless you know what you're doing and where you're doing it. We're also looking at the insects and the invertebrates and the animals, as you saw from some of the camera traps earlier in the forest, and we've really looked at the diversity of those, and we have also looked at whether there's a difference in the ambient and elevated. And of course, well, not of course, it's quite an experimentally noisy system because it's out in the natural environment, and we don't see any differences, which you might not be surprised at, because you'd have to be pretty sedentary as an insect just to live your whole life in that, or all your different bits of your life in that one place. So at the moment, we're not seeing any differences in animal life, and certainly not with the vertebrates in the I think, although, having said that, we're starting to look at the leaves, because I said the leaves are bigger, they've got more carbon, because the tree's got more carbon. The carbon-nitrogen ratio of those leaves, the proportion of carbon to nitrogen, is higher. So effectively, the nitrogen's been diluted by the extra carbon. And so think about it. Imagine you're a caterpillar, a very hungry caterpillar. If you're a very hungry caterpillar, you're not really interested in carbon, you're interested in nitrogen. So if the leaf has got more carbon than nitrogen, you're going to eat more of the leaf. So there is a hypothesis that you'll get more leaf damage from chewing pests under elevated CO2. And we haven't seen that yet, but the data's starting to come through. You could also argue that the tree's got more spent on defence, and so you won't be able to eat it as much. But again, these are hypotheses that we haven't got the data yet, but it is coming through. So if you want to tour the forest, you can. We can organise trips, but it's not very far. If you want to do it from the comfort of your own armchair, excuse me, you can do it through this virtual tour. So there's a 3D virtual tour. You can go around on your phone, this link, I'll put it up at the end and you check it. But you can go up in the canopy. If you go up in the canopy, Anna will talk to you about how she does her measurements. There's little videos of Anna talking. Every time a paper gets published that comes from the FACE, Free Air Carbon Enrichment Experiment, I translate it, sort of layperson's thing, and I stick it in there. So here's the root growth experiment. This is Anna up in the tree. And you can see all the control systems as well, so you can walk around and look at that. And it has, around that, there's a whole load to, if you know anybody who's a school teacher, send this to them, because there's a whole load of education resources that talk to GCSE, Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, Key Stage 5, there's a whole load of stuff here to really get these things that are so important that we get our young people engaged with the science of this. And often it's not taught in an engaging way in schools. And so this can really, because they want to be doctors and dentists or David Attenborough, basically. So you can't get them to be plant scientists or ecologists anymore. So this is real, and the DFE is quite worried about that as well. So we're working quite hard on that, and this is part of the resource to have the virtual tour. So have a look at that. I update it all the time. So I'll just finish off. So I told you about the dendrometer and the tree rings, and of course tree rings are a historical record of what happened in the past, and you can line those up with everything from volcanic eruptions to droughts to heat, even disease, and then you can extrapolate that into the future. And we use dendrology in these forests because the more carbon that's captured, the more sugar that's made, and you saw I said 9% of that sugar on a wet year goes into the rings, and they make bigger tree rings. And tree rings are quite interesting. Unfortunately, my colour coding has gone wrong here, but if you know anything about tree rings, there are 3 bits to a tree ring. There's the cambium, which anybody who goes to France and changes their money, cambio means change, they're dividing cells. And on the outside they divide into phloem, which is one of my favourite things, but I'm not going to talk about it here. Phloem is simply the pipe that carries the sugar from the leaves to the roots. On the inside they make xylem. Xylem is the Greek word for wood. Okay, and those are the pipes that carry the water from the roots to the leaves. And xylem, although it's dead, is really interesting. So you have the bark, you have the phloem, you have the vascular cambium, and you have the xylem. And each year, the tree makes another set of those, and that's where your rings come from. And the more energy the cambium has, the more they can make, and so the bigger the tree ring is. So you get nice big xylem vessels, nice big conducting tissue. And each year you get different ones, and you can work out whether that was a good year or not. But tree rings are not just about the amount of carbon that the tree has. They're also about the size and shape of the xylem vessels. That's a xylem vessel. That's a xylem vessel. This is they're basically tubes, right? Dead tubes of lignin, woody material, and they have this spiral thickening. That's a scanning electron micrograph, and that's just a light micrograph. It's been stained with a chemical that makes the lignin go red. And you get a sense of looking into that. It's a big tube for conducting water. And the water evaporates from the leaves, and it's pulled up, it's sucked up by the cohesion of the water molecules. And the pressures in these xylem tubes are negative, so they're below vacuum because it's water under tension. Does anybody here crack their knuckles? You're not admitting.
Not now.
No. When you do it to students, somebody at the back, you hear this crack, crack, crack. When you crack, or when you hear somebody crack your knuckles, what you're doing is you've got synovial fluid between your joints, right? And when you pull your finger, you reduce the pressure in the fluid. And eventually, when it gets to its boiling point at room temperature, it boils. Okay, because if you reduce the pressure, things boil at a lower temperature. That's why you can't make a cup of tea on top of Everest, because I think water boils at 70 degrees on the top of Everest because the pressure's lower. So the lower that pressure gets, the more likely that water column is to snap, and that's what the cavitation is. If you put a microphone on a tree, you can hear it. Hot sunny day, you hear loads of clicks as these things snap. It's called cavitation. At night, luckily for us, the roots flush it out again, and the tree can start the day with a new set of xylem vessels. Why am I telling you this about tree rings? Because if you're a big tube like that, you can conduct water very efficiently up to the leaves. But big tubes cavitate more easily. If you're a narrow tube, you're not very good at transporting water, but you're cavitation resistant. And so what trees do in that cambium that's making the xylem vessel, if it's wet, and so you don't need to suck as hard to get the water to the leaves, they make nice big easy transport vessels. And then over the summer, if it dries out, what they do is they start making narrower ones. It's another compromise. Okay, I don't want to cavitate because I've got to suck much harder, but I'll transport less water, but at least the xylem will remain functional. So through the season, from the spring, the nice wet spring through to the dry summer, you got, in some tree species, you get a gradient of xylem vessel diameters into the summer and into the autumn. And so that, coupled with the biomass, the amount of sugar you've got to make a ring in the first place, gives you this pattern of tree rings. So they actually contain lots more information than you might have thought, and therefore are really quite useful. But again, illustrate that you're dealing with both water to try and avoid cavitation and carbon capture. Okay, this is something I was doing with my students this afternoon. There's a big database in America. Might close down and has closed down. It's partially because of Trump cutting the environmental budgets, but it's the International Tree Ring Database, and you can download tree ring data from all around the world. We get our students to do projects on these. This is an oak tree that was cut down in 1978 in Ludlow. Okay, and it germinated sometime in the 1880s. It grew to maturity, and one of the points I want to make about this goes back to planting trees. Young trees don't actually capture very much carbon because they're getting bigger and bigger and growing. They're only useful, in this case this is an oak tree, about 40 years before this tree is mature enough to be capturing enough carbon. So if you want to use oak trees to capture carbon, you're going to have to wait a long time if you're planting from scratch. Okay? But then the thing that we get the students to look at because you can download Met Office data, and they do more than one tree, obviously. Is this a dry year, a hot year? Is this a year where there wasn't much sunshine, or was there a volcanic eruption where we got sun? So you can look at these, and you can actually identify all these once you've got consistent things with weather patterns. So this is so that's probably all I should say. This is the link to the virtual resources. We can organise a trip if you want to do that at some point. Other than that, that's all I've got to say. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you look at your oak trees so we learn a bit more little decisions in their lives they have to make. They're not necessarily happy. They're constantly worrying about the weather, just like you were at the beginning of this talk. And so have a thought for your oak trees. And if anybody would like to get a core of this larch tree that I've brought, you can have a go after tea. That's how we get cores of trees that we haven't cut down. So this is a core. And it's just like, you know when you see on these cookery programs, they look at a cheese to see if it's ready. It's just like that. Not as tasty. Okay, thank you very much.
A few minutes to get the kettles on and tea ready, think about questions ready for after the break.
No such thing as a stupid question.
Okay, folks, hopefully you've thought of those questions. Okay, so would anybody like to start off with a question?
I'm sure they make a good job.
I believe that methane, which is a worse greenhouse gas than CO2, has been released from the tundra by the global warming.
This is true, yeah. The frozen permafrost in Siberia and other places, as you warm it up, the metabolism starts and the methane comes out.
Yeah.
And methane is a more active, more proficient greenhouse gas than CO2.
Yeah.
But it doesn't last as long because it gets metabolized and actually produces CO2 itself.
Absolutely.
But one of the things I was telling somebody while we were having a cup of tea was another thing in the forest, and another reason that you should protect mature trees is if you look at the bark of the trees about head height, they've got all these lichens and things, all this little ecosystem. And what one of our BiFOR colleagues has just shown in the last year is that whole microbial ecosystem captures methane and strips it out of the atmosphere. So mature forests are a sink for methane. We don't fully understand why, but it does it. So that's another reason to keep mature forests and to look after them.
Another one, do coniferous trees produce oxygen the same way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reason that gymnosperms are more northern is they keep the leaves all year because they want to be, if there's a couple of sunny days, they want to have the leaves there in order to capture that sunlight, whereas your deciduous trees drop them because there's no point and they might get damaged. You know why gymnosperms are called gymnosperms, don't you?
It would seem to me that there may be an ideal mix of trees then.
Yeah. They're fast growing, of course. So gymnosperms are called gymnosperms. Sperm means seed and gymno means naked. Right? Same root as gymnasium. I tell my students this, and I've stopped saying it because I might get into trouble because all the lectures are recorded. Because the Greeks would go to the gym naked. That's why it was called the gymnasium. And so naked seed. And the broadleaf trees and the flowering plants, the conifers, they're called angiosperms. And angio means container because the seed is actually in a seed coat, which makes it more robust and it can survive longer. And whereas when it comes out of the cone, the gymnosperm seed is just naked and it's got to germinate. It can't survive. So, good, I managed to tell my naked joke.
Just going back to methane, some years ago there was a TV programme and it was talking about all this frozen methane locked. Was it in the sea?
I think I heard that.
In the sea, and they said it's going to evaporate and really get. Anything changed on those?
I don't know. I'm a plant scientist, and I don't know about that. I've heard. I think I've probably heard the same thing as you.
Yeah.
I suppose you just get reassured by the fact, if there is reassurance, that if it was CO2, it's going to stay there unless you pull it out. Whereas methane, as a more organic compound, is going to get metabolized out. But it produces CO2. But,
Yeah, the net effect of methane over its lifetime, both the methane and the CO2, is roughly double that of the quantity of CO2 in the first place. But that underwater methane, this is one of the possible tipping points. As the ocean warms, that will come out of suspension in the water and will boil off. So that's what they're worried about there. Can I ask a question? When you are injecting CO2 into the survey areas, is that actually reducing the temperature in there? When you the pressure drop?
really good question. I didn't show you the pictures, but you've got the liquid CO2 in those enormous tanks. What there are is a series of fans that warm it up, and so it goes in at the right temperature. But that reminds me to tell you another story, that on top of the pylons there are thermal imaging cameras, and they're pointing at the ambient and elevated CO2. What the thermal imaging camera tells us that under elevate, the patches with the extra carbon dioxide are 1.3 degrees warmer. And that's because, anybody guess? No, it's not. It's the stomata. They're shut. There's not going to do as much CO2, so we're shut a bit. So they're losing less water. They're effectively sweating less because the evaporation of water will cool the leaves.
So there's less transpiration.
Yeah, exactly. So 1.3 degrees warmer. So if you're thinking about using trees in urban situations where everybody thinks they're a good thing for cooling cities, urban islands are cooler because there's trees in them and so on. If in 50 years' time, under elevated CO2, those trees aren't going to be able to do that as well because they're closing their stomata in this photosynthesis transpiration compromise.
I did read a couple of years ago that the Russians fell quite a few square miles of taiga every year, but they're not replanting any.
Well, that's true around the globe. I mean, look at Brazil. I mean, we did it historically. I mean, before the time of the Vikings or something, UK was totally covered. Wordsworth's I Wandered Low to the Cloud and his love of the Lakeland Hills, they're an ecological desert. They should be covered in beech trees. But we don't. The way we view the environment is through the lens of recent history and culture rather than the ecology of the system. Scotland, for example, it should be covered in conifers, but because of grouse shooting and the clearances and the sheep, they keep it clear. They overgraze it.
A bit of a controversial sort of this question. Is it better to have a solar farm or wooded area?
Okay, but I think it depends what you're trying to do, of course, right? Because they're not the same thing. I would say the ecosystem services, the things that a mature oak forest that's managed properly does for you, go far beyond capturing carbon. Things about well-being, things about biodiversity, cultural things, products, all these sort of things. But I read something recently about these farms, and people saying, "Oh, it's taken out all this land." But some of the ecology people were saying, "Well, actually, it doesn't, because you can run chickens under it, and you can have sheep running it, so it's not totally degraded land." I think to take a mature forest, and this is just a personal view, I think to take a mature forest out and put a solar farm on it would be a bad thing. But to take a brownfield site and put a solar farm on it and have some grass and some sheep and some chickens or something underneath would be a good thing. So they're all relative, aren't they?
Actually, if you did it right, solar farm is the permanent thing. So if you did it right and you grew legumes under it, you could actually produce much more enriched soil that when you finish with the solar farm, you can plant trees in. But what I wondered was, are we seeing any effects with what you're seeing of the way the frontiers for different species are moving north.
Not in this experiment,
No.
because it's too small. It's only like 7 football pitches or
I
whatever.
just wondered,
But no, that is a general ecological principle that people are seeing. I do a field course in Norway, what we see there is things that are adapted to high mountain environments because of the temperature, and as it warms up, other things come up and outcompete them.
there's nowhere to go.
There's nowhere to go, yeah. So you go up and up and up the mountains to get to cooler places, and then you disappear. I wrote another story about that and the tops of mountains. So there are a lot of plants that, this isn't really climate change, but there are a lot of plants that are adapted to low nutrients, such as the top of Cairngorm, where it's ground up granite, which is very good soil. And the plants that are adapted there are adapted to deal with low nutrients. And plants that need more nutrients can't get there. And there was a situation a few years back, a decade or so now, where people were going up there and scattering ashes on the top, because Uncle Tom liked going up the top of Cairngorm. And they had to explain to people, well, the thing that Uncle Tom liked, Uncle Tom's destroying because he's inputting phosphorus into the land, and the plants that are held back by phosphorus are growing and out competing the things that he liked. So now if you go, there are gardens at the bottom that explain this, where you scatter the ashes in the garden at the bottom, rather than ruining the plant communities at the top.
Yeah, it is often this problem, but if you think you know a nice simple answer in an ecological context, you're probably wrong.
Yeah.
The first attempts to stop algal bloom in America, they thought it was over nitrogen, too much nitrogen going in from detergents.
Yeah.
No, to detergents. So they switched to a potassium-based one. It turns out that they couldn't use all the nitrogen. What they were short of was potassium.
Yeah.
So it actually made things worse. It's like introducing cane toast to control.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look, there's acid lowland heath, which is a bit like Sutton Park in the Netherlands, and that's held back by nutrients, and the pollution, nitrogen pollution, fallout from the Ruhr industrial thing that fell on the Dutch areas started stimulating the plants that were short of nitrogen and affecting the biodiversity there.
Yeah.
Is bracken seems to be much more of a problem than ivy, I've noticed over the years, certainly in this area. Have you got much comment about that? Certainly
Not to do with this, except that when you talk about stomatal control, there's another story about stomata, I'll tell you, right? So, since you asked the question, and then I'll tell you what I know about bracken, which isn't necessarily to do with it. So when stomata close to save water because of this drop in pressure, in ferns, what happens is the leaf loses water and the stomatal cells lose water as well, and they just close because they've lost water, but the leaf's now lost water. The horse has bolted and it's too late to close the door. But around the time of ferns evolution, plants evolved this thing called root-to-shoot signalling. And what happens is, as the roots start to dry out, a hormone called abscisic acid is produced by the roots, and it goes in the xylem up to the leaves, and it ends up at the stomata, and it closes the stomata before the leaf dries out. Only the stomata are affected. It's called partial root zone drying. And it shows you that the xylem's really important. And those of you who drink, and those of you who drink Australian wine, will have partaken of this because Australian wines are irrigated with drip feeds on either side of the vine. And when they found out about this partial root zone drying, what they did was they now only irrigate one side of the vine. And so you've got one partially dry side and one wet side. The wet side feeds the vine. The dry side partially closes the stomata, and they use 60% less water. And they claim the yield is as good, if not better. It's a very simple thing, but discovered through the fundamental science. Oh, and the thing about bracken, I saw it on, Carding Mill Valley over in I saw them spraying all that once because Because actually, sheep don't eat it because it's a carcinogenic.
Yeah.
Whereas apparently in Japan it's a delicacy. But why it survives because of the rhizomes under the ground, which they survive anything. And, they're all mats of these things. Nothing eats them, and you can't get rid of them.
Good question.
At the beginning of your talk, you showed us a graph, and it was very high, the carbon dioxide, the start, and then it came down very low, and then it started to go up again. Why did it come down, and why did it go up?
I think it came down because it was in the Carboniferous, and this is when the coal measures were laid down.
What atmosphere did that?
Well, I think at some point, and I'd have to look at the graph again. At some point, the blue-green algae cracked the how to do photosynthesis, and so dropped the CO2 levels. And then there were a few of the 5 major extinctions where are tied to climate change because the volcanoes produce the CO2, and that goes back up again. I can't remember which of 2 or 3 major ones and people study those because although they were over a much longer time period than our production of carbon dioxide, because ours is the fastest ever. There's never been that fast.
At the beginning of that graph, it was extremely high compared with...
Yeah, because there wasn't any photosynthesis because it hadn't properly evolved yet. Because it started in the blue-green algae. And so once the algae start photosynthesizing, they pull down the carbon from the atmosphere.
In a couple of months, the talk will cover a bit of that.
And the other thing that's interesting is, because they pulled down all the carbon dioxide, the oxygen levels have gone up. And because those oxygen levels have gone up, you can have fire, and they start to discover charcoal fossils. You probably can talk about that. So you can infer that, because you can have fires, you can infer what the oxygen levels would have been, and that ties into the reciprocal of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
Yeah, in astronomy, when they're looking at 4 exoplanets, they used to think that oxygen was necessary for life. But they've now decided that life is necessary to produce oxygen. So they're still looking for it, but for the opposite reason.
Yeah, it's extremely toxic oxygen, and I mentioned that the enzymes Rubisco that does photosynthesis isn't very good because it evolved under very high CO2. So when the CO2 is low, it actually does the reverse of photosynthesis and converts sugar into CO2. It's called photorespiration. And so a lot of adaptations of plants, because we talk about photosynthesis, there are 3 sorts of photosynthesis. C3 photosynthesis, which is the normal one, but then maize plants do something called C4 photosynthesis. And what they do is they take in the CO2 and they don't photosynthesize it immediately. They put it in the middle of the leaf, wrap it around the Rubisco, so the Rubisco thinks it's living in a patch with very high levels, and it never experiences low levels of photosynthesis. So that's maize, and that's why maize is more drought tolerant, because it can concentrate the CO2. It doesn't have to worry about external. And that's why C3 plants are stimulated by extra CO2 and C4 plants aren't, because they've already concentrated it. So if you were growing wheat and maize, as the levels go up in the atmosphere, you predict the maize does better, and the wheat does better, and the maize just stays where it is. And then there's pineapples. Do you want to know about pineapples? Yeah. So pineapples are what are called CAM plants, crassulaceous acid metabolism, right? And what they do, unlike all other plants, and there's about, not just pineapples, there's hundreds of examples of these, they open their stomata at night to save water, because we've already established you don't want to open your stomata if you don't want to lose water. They open the stomata at night, they take in the CO2, but they can't make sugar because there isn't any light. So they make oxalic acid or other organic acids, which is what gives apples the tart taste. They store it in vacuoles, which is why they're fleshy. So when people say cacti store water, they don't. They store carbon dioxide, right? And then they shut the stomata during the day, release the carbon dioxide inside the plant, and use the light to make the sugars. that's why cacti and these type of can plants are drought tolerant, not because they save water. The fleshiness is the store for, and the reason that it was discovered, this may be apocryphal, is there was a scientist who was walking to the lab across the botanical gardens in the morning, and like some of us stupidly do, he tasted the plant in the morning on the way to work, and he tasted it on the way back. And in the morning it was sour, and when he picked it off the same plant in the evening, it was sweet. And you can see the pH change if you take them. Have I given all your punchlines?
No, I think it's just brilliant.
Thank you. Jerry, I think what you taught us is shows the incredible complexity of climate change and how it's not a simple story. And as I mentioned to you before the break, this is one of the things that's anecdotally people say, well, the winters were a lot worse when I was a kid, or the summers were a lot warmer. And it's a load of nonsense, because actually there's no way that you can put climate change into that box. But I guess, I've got so many questions in my head for you that would be here all night. But I guess one thing that I get from this is, how long is the experiment going to go on for?
Till at least 2034, because that's how long we got money for CO2.
Right, brilliant, excellent. So it's still got a while to...
Unless you want to put your hand in your pocket.
If you'd mentioned it earlier, I thought some change happened. And I guess secondly, just looking at the seasonality of things, that I think you showed one graph there that I sort of honed in on, which was the growth in 2020, I think, which increased, and that's quite an interesting one. I was thinking kind of the seasonality of that, because of course that was COVID year. So it's one that we all remember was glorious COVID spring, whereas we went in on the sort of 20th, 21st of March was fantastic weather. As we came out in, was it early June, that's when it broke. So the spring was excellent actually. I'm trying to wrap my brains about the summer. I don't think the summer was quite as good, but the growth was accelerated even though it was dry. So does that mean that the trees are mostly putting on growth mid-season, mid to late season? What is the seasonality like? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, you saw the photosynthesis from Anna's graphs.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the carbon capture.
Yeah.
So that's how much is being put into the hopper.
Yeah.
Of course, there will be all sorts of delays of storage and then remobilisation. Does it go directly into growth, or does the tree keep some back? Because although a lot of the inner bit of the trunk, the heartwood, doesn't do anything because it's all blocked off. A lot of the other stuff is storing starch and other things that can be recycled. So there is a buffer there. So I don't think there's a direct correlation that will be easy to show between Anna's photosynthesis data in 2018 and what happened immediately the next year or that year. So I think it starts to be buffered. I also, that worries me when I talk about tree rings, and I freak the students out talking about this, because they find a really nice shape and they can show that all these trees drop for a decade, and then they try and explain it, and you go, well, actually it could be the weather the previous 5 years, and there's all sorts of complicated correlations you can do. So as you said, it's complicated, and we don't really know, but I think things like these enormous data sets are something that something like AI can start to get its head around, because you can ask it, you can put all that data in and it'll look for patterns. That's what it's good at.
Yeah, so long as the data sets are still available.
Well, like I said, if Trump doesn't shut this site down, this data that you can download all sorts of stuff for free that somebody put in there in 1970, and it's all there, and nobody looks at it because it's not trendy anymore. It's not molecular.
Fine, so I just want for you then. So we saw Anna at the top of the tree taking the readings. How come that's not automated? Why is she having to go up there? And that's not automated.
And the way that you measure photosynthesis is in something called an infrared gas analyzer.
Okay.
And it's basically, she has it strapped to her chest and it's got carbon dioxide scrubbers and things in it. But what it is, you've got a lot of these measurements have got to be non-destructive, because you couldn't go up every day because you'd end up and you denude the whole thing. So basically, it's a little cuvette, and you clamp it onto the leaf, and you squirt air in one side, and it comes out the other. And you basically, you ramp up the light intensity from 0 to maximum, and you measure the rate of CO2 uptake, comparing what went in, what went out. and you generate something called an ACI curve, a photosynthesis carbon concentration curve. And she can do that non-destructively, and you clip it on. If it's like that, I'm sitting here and the tree's here, and I just go like that, wait a few minutes, take it off, take this clip, then I do the one over here, then I do one, then I go down and I do the next one. So that's how those measurements are done.
Yeah.
There are other measurements for like water potential things where you have to break the twig and you put it in a pressure bomb and you measure water potential and things like that. But those are destructive. Even the coring of the trees we haven't done very often because we want to be as little intervention as possible. We have got a site next to it next to the face, where we're putting nutrients on the trees to see how nutrient limited they are, which then helps us interpret the CO2 data. But we're not putting anything apart from CO2 into these woods as far as we can.
Excellent, thank you. And what about, just one more, sorry, I'm kind of So, you mentioned there the eucalyptus, the oaks, the difference between the two, the updates. Do we know the percentage globally of how many are in the oak category, how many are in the eucalyptus category?
Yeah,
we know what that is.
We do. It's not a direct answer to the question because I don't know that specifically. But if you do the virtual tour and you go to the top of the tower at the end, there's a link to a review paper which has the 6 face experiments of recent times and their data, and what it's tried to do is plot, and because they're all got slightly different conditions, so it's an awkward thing to compare because they weren't all designed at the same time. But all of the different experiments under different levels of elevated CO2 are all about, it's something like, I think it's an increase in net primary productivity under elevated CO2 of something like 20-25%, irrespective of where there's. So there's a one-to-one line, basically, and they all sit above it. That's not really a straight answer, but if you look at that paper, maybe that'll answer the question, because it's trying to kind of bring all this stuff together.
Fascinating. Brilliant. How right, shut up now.
Anything else? So next time when you see a company...
Can I just say, I know you want to finish, and that's my point. My VC, before the one we got at the moment, we used to go to meetings with him, and I didn't work this out for a while, but after a while we'd have a conversation, and then he'd go, has anybody got anything wise to say? And I didn't realise that meant everybody shut up because we finished.
People wouldn't say anything then. What I was going to say is that next time when the company says we're carbon neutral because we've gone out there and we've planted loads of trees, you can certainly question that.
Especially when you get planning good positions coming through, they say, oh, we're replacing all the trees.
Yeah. Okay, so we'd like to hands together again. So thank you. If you could put the chairs back, please. Safe journey.